It seems to be human nature to learn. The voracious appetite for knowledge has yet to be observed in other animals. We see brief curiosity throughout the animal kingdom, but the human curiosity is something that separates Homo sapiens from the rest of our living companions. Why is that? What makes us so different from the rest of them? To many, an answer seems simple enough to pull out of thin air. We are evolutionary better than other animals because that is how our traits played out to create an apex predator. That all makes sense until you need a better answer. Saying we are evolutionarily superior to other animals means that there must be a reason why. Settling for that's just the way it is a cop-out. In this essay, I will attempt to tackle the complex question of where we came from. My true belief, along with others, is that we have been visited by races of extraterrestrial beings early in our prehistory who through genetic manipulation created the Homo sapiens and the vast cognitive separation between us and our closest primitive relative. I'm not the only one in this idea. Many books have been published. The lust for knowledge is a thirst that can never be quenched, and so it would make sense that as history goes on, we built larger and larger databases of information, useful or not. One topic, though, has always been closely guarded. The concept of where we came from has always been a, the concept of where we came from has been a relatively permanent hold on the general population's mind. Before 1859's release of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the common idea of human origins was that we all came from Adam and Eve. Even though that story asked more questions than it answered, it was widely held as factual knowledge, and if you didn't agree with it, you were blasphemous. When Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace set out to explain evolutionary genetics, their work was met with great skepticism. More than 150 years after the release of Darwin's work, the idea of evolution is so rooted in our culture that if you believe in Adam and Eve, you are either misinformed or dead set in divinity explaining everything in your world. The problem with this method of sporadic paradigm shift is that the individual opinions on the topic are too securely founded in the citizens' minds for it to be easily changed. People don't like to be proven wrong, especially when the truth sounds more bizarre than fiction. The origins of the human race have rarely, if ever, been disputed, and when it is ridiculed. When you really get into the concept of what made life as we know it, questions come up. When you credit Adam and Eve in the biblical story of Genesis, then questions such as diversity come up. How can an Oriental man look so drastically different from his Caucasian ancestors? With this question, the answer, the diversification issue, and to this would seem to answer the diversification issue, and to many, that's where their search ends. They believe that since the basic questions have been answered with little outcry, then the explanation holds. The problem with this methodology is that it doesn't support the fervorous appetite for learning that characterizes the human race. A theory should only stand true if it is undisputed, and even then, based on falsification, it is only not false rather than true. After working with Darwin on the theory of evolution, Alfred Wallace came to his own conclusion. Some intelligent power has guided or determined the development of man. Wallace, expressing his opinion, should be looked at with more scientific presence. However, this quote is lost to the archive because the content of what he said means we have to once again need a paradigm shift to understand our true origins. Let's say for the sake of argument, we deciphered Wallace's quote to mean that in our past, extraterrestrials visited the Earth and interfered with the natural selection of the human strain of intelligence. This is not to say that natural selection and the survival of the fittest are outdated school of thoughts, but that there is simply more to the story. One would be pressed to ask, what would make an evolutionist who has so closely worked with Darwin say that he believes that there was extraterrestrial intervention? He said it because that is where the evidence directed him. The difference between Wallace and a majority of the population is that when Wallace came to a certain conclusion, he followed it as opposed to the presumed mode of action, which is to vilify and label as conspiratorial. One thing that can consistently be agreed on is the sheer advantage we have over the other animals. We are light years ahead of our closest relative in terms of cognitive ability. The concept of natural selection would mean that the human race would be aptly tuned to simply survive and reproduce. After all, that was and still is the sole purpose of every other living thing on the planet. So why is there only one species that is so unique? The identity of an animal is deciphered by its genetic code, which is tightly wound into chromosomes. A typical house dog and a fox share 2% of difference in DNA. Humans and apes have the same 2% difference. Does it really seem feasible that the vast amount of personality difference that humans carry are possible in that 2% of genetic difference? Alfred Wallace once said, "Nature never overendows a species beyond the needs of everyday existence." Yet man has plenty of traits that outstand the need for everyday existence. The human brain has trillions of synapses that work overtime to not only eat, have sex, and to sleep, but to create art, to solve algorithms, and to question the meaning of life. According to Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, large changes in a species' genetic code take tens of millions of years, and macro changes take hundreds of millions of years. Yet man went through several macro changes in the course of 6 million years. Are all these accelerated macro changes bunched up in that 2% of our DNA? If so, what made that 2% so divine as opposed to other differentiations in species code? Our issue is that people's lack of interest stems from the lack of interest in pursuing such information. We tend to go for what is told to us as opposed to investigating it for ourselves. When we look into the past for answers of our origin, we tend to search for literature that describes the time of the era. Without a second beat, majority of the population would pick up their Holy Bible as their historical reference. This is a very narrow-minded method of interpreting information. The Bible is one book composed of 5 separate books, plus additional stories and writings. Since this is one book, it is simply one opinion that has been ingrained in us since we were born into this world. If we grew up in a religious society, growing up in the United States very much is so, then from day one we are told to not only accept, but to worship one book as the Word of God. This conflicts with our quest for knowledge, being that if we step out of the biblical box, we are condemned. For those that step out of the box without fear of persecution, an array of resources present themselves. Across ancient cultures, the idea that we came from gods is prevalent. Even in the Old Testament, the origins of the word Elohim stretch back to Sumerian tablets, known as the Enuma Elish. Elohim is a plural form of God, meaning that everywhere in the Bible that says Elohim, they mean gods. This simple misinterpreted translation changes the whole concept that the Bible was founded on. According to the third of Arthur C. Clarke's 3 laws, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And when you really think about it, magic is indistinguishable from divinity. The idea of a cargo cult is that an indigenous people get contacted by commercial first world settlers and based on their slim understanding of technology, worship them as gods. One example is the Vanuatu Island group that lies northeast of Australia. Ever since contact with white travelers in the 1940s, they worship a deity called John From. Because the white men introduced themselves as John from California, John from New Jersey, etc. These Johns had advanced technology so past the indigenous people's levels of understanding that to them it seemed like magic and in turn divine. Could that same process of events not have happened thousands of years ago? My concluding point is simply this, that we need to ask more questions. I have come to this conclusion based on individual research far surpassing the work cited in this paper, but it is still just a theory. The important point is that we as a planetary consciousness need to be more open to change. The system we are a part of intentionally indoctrinates us to think that there is only one way to think, and that is the way your parents did. I present this idea as a different viewpoint to answer my own personal questions. Is it right? I may never be sure, but at least it is tackling the human element